I'm Don Mockholtz, and you are listening to Looking Up with Don. This is the Looking Up with Don podcast, episode number 14 for the week of April 8th, 2020. The related website for this podcast is donmockholtz.com. That is spelled DONMACHHOLZ.com, 2 H's. What's up in the sky this week? As our week begins on Wednesday, April 8th, the moon has just passed the full phase, and it was a so-called supermoon, being closer and brighter than most full moons. And it is technically now in the morning sky, but you will be seeing it rise shortly after evening twilight early in the week. By this weekend, the moon rises about midnight local time, and it reaches third quarter next Tuesday, April 14th. The moon makes a nice passage south of both Jupiter and Saturn on Tuesday, April 14th, and Wednesday, April 15th. The Eastern Hemisphere is favored for this passage, but anyone going out on those mornings, April 14th and 15th, will see a nice grouping of the moon, Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. This is a good photo opportunity. Venus still dominates our evening sky, having passed through the Pleiades last week. Over the next couple weeks, it will be at its brightest, and with no moon in the sky, let's see if we can see the shadow cast by the light of the planet Venus. Now, this is not just an academic exercise. It is designed to help you sharpen your eyesight in low contrast situations. If you do this enough and get good at it, your ability to see in low contrast situations will improve. Not so much your eyes, but also your brain and how it processes shades of brightness. You may be able to see things in the night sky you could never see before. So consider this as a necessary exercise from time to time to get into shape and stay in shape. Now, the sun is bright enough that you can easily see a shadow, and we're quite familiar with this. The moon, most so when it is full, casts a shadow too. Raise your hand if you've ever been frightened by your shadow in moonlight. Yeah, me too. The planets and stars cast enough light to form a shadow, so let's get to the planet Venus. Here is how I have done it. Go outside as the sky is getting completely dark, which is about 90 minutes after sunset. Find a dark place where you can see the planet Venus in the west. Once, for me, it was on Forest Hill Road in Northern California, standing in the middle of the roadway, with tall pine trees on either side of the road and Venus right down the road. Or go stand on the west side of a house or building, or on the west side of your car. This will hide from you the light from the eastern part of the sky. Let your eyes get adapted to the darkness. Now, this might take 10 to 15 minutes. Just have a seat and just wait. Be patient. Don't fall asleep like I sometimes do when I sit down in the dark. Hold up a sheet of white paper a foot or so from your eyes, and looking at the paper, slowly wave your hand with your fingers spread apart between the paper and Venus as if you're waving at Venus. If you look carefully for pattern changes on the paper, it will be subtle. What you are looking for is a shadow of your hand on the paper. Now, since Venus is a tiny light source, the shadow of your hand will be a sharp shadow with very distinct edges. Try using averted vision, concentrating on the paper while looking off a bit to the side. If the light pollution is too strong to do this outside, you can go inside your house or garage or shop, or any structure that has a westward-facing window or door. Go inside, darken the room, open the shade, drapes, or door, and let Venus's light fall on the wall opposite the window, or if Venus is high in the sky, on the floor. Close the door to the room and turn off all lights, and make the room as dark as possible. Once again, let your eyes get accustomed to the darkness. Go over to that wall or floor and look carefully for variations in brightness caused by the window frame or the doorway blocking some of the light from Venus. We're looking for a faint but distinct shadow. If you see nothing, then try this. Wave your hand back and forth between Venus and the wall and look for the shadow of your hand. The International Space Station is visible depending upon your location. It orbits the Earth every 90 minutes at a height of about 400 kilometers or 260 miles. And if it's within about 1,400 kilometers or 900 miles of your location, and the lighting is right, it should be visible to you. 90 minutes later, the space station is in about the same place that it was before, but now you have moved as the Earth has been rotating for those 90 minutes, so it will not be in the same part of your sky. For this next week, those north of about 40 degrees will not see it. Sorry, Canada, Denmark, England, Germany, and Russia. Those living south of 40 degrees north and as far south as 25 degrees south will see it in their evening sky some nights, and the further south you go, the more nights it will be visible. So Florida, Japan, Egypt, India, Colombia, you will get evening passes of the International Space Station. Those south of 25 degrees south, and I'm talking Australia, New Zealand, the southern part of South America, and South Africa, will see the International Space Station in their morning sky, sometimes twice per morning. Now, to determine where it will be in your sky, you can go to the website heavens-above.com, enter your location, then click on ISS. An unmanned spacecraft named BepiColumbo, which is on its way to the planet Mercury, will be making a flyby Earth on April 9th and 10th. Western Africa, far west Europe, and much of the Western Hemisphere is favored to see the spacecraft. Also, the Southern Hemisphere has a better seat to view this than the Northern Hemisphere. Now, the moon will be only a couple days past full, so it will be bright and rising shortly after the sky gets dark. The object, the spacecraft, will be as bright as magnitude 9 and will appear as a very slow-moving star. You'll need a pair of binoculars at least, or a telescope to see it. It is about 20,000 kilometers, which is about 12,000 miles away, and it's about the size of a minivan or small bus. It's not in a hurry to get to Mercury. It's still 18 months from its first Mercury flyby, and after 6 flybys of Mercury, it will finally go into orbit around it in late 2025. Now, the exact location where this spacecraft will be visible depends upon your location, and you can go to heavens-above.com and click on Sighting Opportunities for the BepiColumbo Earth Flyby on April 10th. That will tell you where it will be in the sky, including right ascension, declination, for every 10 or 15 minutes. Comet Atlas, Comet 2019 Y4, continues to evolve in our evening northern sky. Now, for much of March, it was brightening fairly rapidly, and it produced a lot of optimism that this could become a very bright comet. As we've said, comets are quite unpredictable. Over the last 2 weeks, it has not been brightening as rapidly. And over the past week, as we entered into early April, the comet has even perhaps dimmed a bit. And there's some concern about the fact that perhaps the comet nucleus has split, or it might be going through some type of evolution that has caused it to dim. It may be brightening up again over the next few weeks, but if the nucleus has fragmented, it would probably more than likely be fading out. Another oddity that the astronomers have been noticing is that it seems to have some fairly large non-gravitational forces. Now, comets orbit the sun much like an asteroid does, with one exception, that the comet is jetting out material as it moves in toward the sun. And some of those jets may change the course of the comet nucleus slightly as it goes around the sun. If there are great non-gravitational movements on the comet nucleus, it's possible that it could be a very tiny nucleus, despite the fact one study a few weeks ago showed it to be fairly large. If it's fairly small and it has moderate jetting, that could be enough perhaps to explain why it's a little bit off course. Not much, but enough to take notice with a lot of the astronomers. So now is the time to go out and continue watching this comet. See for yourself how it's doing. With the moon not in our evening sky and the moon out of our evening sky for the next 2 weeks, get out there and watch Comet Atlas. It is about 8th magnitude. You can use podcast 14, map number 2, to locate the comet in the evening northwestern sky. And on that particular map, the tick marks are for 0 hours universal time. It's presently moving about 0.5 degrees per day, but it will be picking up speed in coming weeks. This week, let's learn the constellation Cancer. It is labeled on podcast 14, map 1. And it's near the center of the chart, meaning it's overhead. The name of this constellation is Latin for crab, and it kind of looks like one, assuming your crab has only 3 legs. This is not named after the disease known as cancer, which some of us have had, and unfortunately some people now have. It's an unfortunate name. Same with the coronavirus. Now, to an astronomer, corona is a plasma extended atmosphere of the sun and other stars. During a total solar eclipse, that is what you see, the sun's corona. People travel around the world just to see the sun's corona. And then there's a couple constellations with corona in their name. In the northern hemisphere, we have a small constellation known as Corona Borealis, meaning the northern crown. And in the southern hemisphere, there's even a smaller constellation called Corona Australis, or the southern crown. But let's get back to the constellation Cancer. It is in what is known as a zodiac. So the sun, the moon, and the planets roam through this location from time to time. The stars in Cancer are not very bright, but near the center of the constellation is the Beehive Cluster, also known as M44, which we looked at a few weeks ago. So get out there now that the moon is not in the sky and get familiar with the constellation Cancer. For our binocular challenge, let's set up for a close-up of what's up. This week, let's look at the open star cluster in the constellation Gemini, which is known as M35. This is the 35th object in Charles Messier's catalog. This cluster is about 2,800 light years from us, and is about 25 arc minutes in size, which is nearly as large as the full moon. Now, this translates to a cluster diameter of about 20 light years. In binoculars, you should be able to resolve many of the stars. To the northeast sits a smaller cluster, NGC 2158, which may be visible in binoculars under dark sky conditions. It's 6 times farther from us than M35. Now, M35 is located on podcast 14, map number 1. Our telescopic challenge this week is to put your telescope on M35. And through the telescope, you should be able to see at least 60 individual stars, perhaps up to a couple hundred stars. In that second cluster, NGC 2158, it should be easily visible to the northeast of M35. Now for fun with the marathon, the Messier Marathon. For the past few weeks, I've been doing Messier Marathons from my house here in Arizona, and I'm using a variety of telescope and mounts and learning from the experiences. On March 15-16th, I used my 6-inch reflector and I saw 109 objects, missing only M30. Now, on that night, the moon was in third quarter phase, so yes, you can do the marathon when the moon is in the sky. And it's better if it's in the morning sky than in the evening sky. In the morning sky, you generally have your brighter objects. March 23rd, 24th, I used my 10-inch reflector, a very short focal ratio of f3.8, and it has a 2-degree field. It has an equatorial mount, and I picked up all 110 objects. Now, this was a telescope I used in my early days for nearly all of my Messe marathons. For the past 30 years, I have been using my 6-inch reflector, but it was really nice to get out there and use a 10-inch reflector this time. The next night, I used a 16-inch reflector on a Dobsonian mount, and I saw 66 objects in the first 90 minutes. I went to bed, and when I got up in the morning to do the morning objects, it was cloudy, so I could not finish the marathon. This has happened to me about 25% of the time that I start a marathon, that is, to be clouded out in the morning session. I picked up 107 objects on March 26th, 27th using 100mm binoculars on a motorized binocular chair. Now that night, M74 was too faint, and clouds prevented views of M77 and the area around M30. The night of March 27th, 28th, I used my homemade 5.3-inch binoculars and picked up 109 objects with M74 being too faint to see. Now, normally my big binoculars doesn't have a finder, but this time I did use a finder scope, 3-inch aperture, 4-degree field, and that made it actually much easier to see things in a dark sky. My search sequence for the binoculars had to be modified because these binoculars weigh 120 pounds and are difficult to use at higher than about a 45-degree altitude. So everything I found had to be under 45 degrees, which meant sometimes waiting a few hours for objects high in the sky in the evening to swing over to the western sky. On the night of March 29th and 30th, I used a 5.3-inch refractor, the same one that I used to discover a comet in 1992. Now, the field of view of this one is 3 degrees, and it's only 20 magnification. The weather forecast for this night was clear, then a few clouds at 9 or 10 p.m., then clear the rest of the night with no mention of rain. My night started with a few clouds in the west, and that prevented me from seeing M77. I did not see M74 due to faintness. Over the next 90 minutes, clouds came and went. By 9:30, it was overcast. I had seen about 60 objects, so I came into the house to get a couple hours of sleep. That's when I checked the Doppler radar and noticed it showed rain headed our way. That was a surprise. So I went back out in minimal clothes to put a tarp on the telescope when suddenly some strong winds arose. It was like the scene from The Wizard of Oz. I thought, when are the flying monkeys going to appear? I covered the telescope, kept it dry. It was cloudy at midnight, but by 2 a.m. it was clear again, so I went back out and finished up the marathon, getting 108 objects. Perhaps you missed out on the Messe Marathon this March, or you would like to do it again. The Messe Marathon can be done any time of the year, and over the past few weeks I've been assembling morning and evening maps and a search sequence for each month of the year. The 110 Messe objects are scattered throughout the sky, and they're not uniformly scattered, but they do bunch up in a couple concentrated areas. One group is what has been referred to as the realm of galaxies. It's a group of 16 galaxies in and around the constellation Virgo. The other group is what is commonly referred to as the summer Milky Way, and it's about 20 clusters and nebula in the constellations around Sagittarius and north of Sagittarius. During the typical Messe Marathon in late March of each year, now these two groups are well placed. The galaxies are in the east in the evening, and they work their way across the sky all night. They give you plenty of time to find and observe them. The summer Milky Way begins rising about 1:30 in the morning, and a half hour to an hour before morning twilight, that whole area is above the horizon, giving you plenty of time to find and observe those objects. The challenge with the late Messier Marathon is finding some galaxies low in the west in the early evening, then finding those globular clusters in the morning sky before morning twilight. That group of galaxies hides behind the sun and are not visible in October, while the summer Milky Way items are not visible in December and January. Because the Earth goes around the sun, our night sky is forever changing. Each evening, objects set 4 minutes earlier than they did the night before, and each morning they rise 4 minutes earlier than they did the morning before. Let me say that again, because now this is an important concept of observational astronomy that affects everything we do, not just the Messier objects. Each evening, objects set 4 minutes earlier than they did the night before, and each morning they rise 4 minutes earlier than they did the morning before. So each evening, M74, a faint galaxy, becomes harder and harder to see in the evening twilight because it sets 4 minutes earlier each evening. M30, which we see in the morning sky, rises 4 minutes earlier each morning and becomes easier to see each morning. In 1 month, those 4 minutes a day adds up to 2 hours. Add the times of twilight changing, and each night we have a slightly different sky, and each month we have a greatly different sky. Objects that were in the western sky at evening twilight last month may not be visible this month, as they would have already set before the sky gets completely dark. Conversely, objects not visible last month in the eastern morning sky may be visible this month as they rise a couple hours earlier while the sky is still dark. By the way, the planets don't always follow that 4-minute rule, especially lately, as we've seen with Venus, whose movement has been keeping it setting at about the same time every evening. Now that will change soon, as Venus will begin creeping back towards the sun. If we look at the number of Messier objects visible on the first night each month, from dusk to dawn, from 35 degrees north latitude, we see a range from 88 objects on January 1st to 108 objects on April 1st. Other months have numbers between this range of 88 to 108. In between the first of each month, the numbers vary a bit, but this is for the first day of each month. Now, what if we want to go out only in the evening and not stay up all night? That is, do a couple hours of Messier objects, then go home. The numbers are a bit less, but they also vary quite widely. The range is from 45 objects in January to 88 objects in July. For the rest of the year, as we near the new moon phase, I'll present a broad outline of what can be seen and not seen if one were to do a Messier Marathon at that time. You have been listening to Looking Up with Don, podcast episode number 14 for April 8th, 2020. Once again, the related website for this podcast is donmachholz.com. That is spelled DONMACHHOLZ, 2 H's. God willing and pod willing, I'll be back next week for another episode of Looking Up with Don. We will discuss what is going on in the sky, our weekly check on Comet Atlas. We'll learn a new constellation, and I'll discuss comet hunting from a mountain called Loma Prieta. And we'll talk about meteor showers. Thank you for listening. See the sky this week. I'll see you next week.